Thank you very much, Dennis, and I want to tell you how pleased I am to be here tonight, and I want to congratulate all of you for braving this potential storm. I don't think it's a storm yet, right? For coming out here, and I hope that we can have a good experience together and it'll all be worthwhile. I'll try to get through my topic, which Dennis forgot to mention, and I've forgotten what the title is. I have some slides and I have some notes, so I think I'll stay on course. And anyway, afterwards, I really would welcome as much interaction between us as is possible in terms of your ideas, which I'm very interested in, as well as questions and any loopholes that I may have left open. I wish you would, well, now he tells me what the title is. Thanks. It says here, Imaging the Future with Observations on the Effects of ELF, that means extremely low frequency radiation, on global weather and biological systems. And that, in fact, is what I'm going to talk about. Now, all of you are aware that there's something wrong with the global weather system. And I think you feel it locally, and every point on the globe that has any number of people on it will agree with you. Everywhere the weather is totally out of line. As you all know, just in December, some 145 or maybe it was 154 weather records were set in the United States around Christmas time. That means all time. That means from the time they started taking measurements on weather data, which isn't that long when you stop to think about it. But anyway, there's something unusual about it. And I'm very amazed. I kind of happen to be an addict of the New York Times, and I read it quite religiously and notice all the little squares about 1 inch by 1.5 inch that note a lot of these weather anomalies all over the globe. And I click and I paste them up. And I noticed that in the commentary on these little items about the weather, whether it's volcanism or earthquakes or floods or droughts or whatever, all anomalies, that nobody in the weather business, and that includes analysts and forecasters and technicians and so on, really wants to deal with this problem on its own terms. So that's what I'm going to do here today, is discuss this problem, and I'm going to refer to that great journal of American mediocrity called the National Geographic, which I love, my kids love it, but you know, it never takes any extreme positions, it never gets out on a limb for anything, right? We all know that. Gil Grosvenor takes care of that. But in the February issue, which I'm sure a lot of you saw, February '84 of the National Geographic, there is an article which I think is deserving of attention on the El Nino phenomena. For those of you who don't know the term, that's a periodic hot water effect off the coast of Ecuador and Colombia and the northern part of Chile. And it is not very well understood. It's been studied only about 40 or 50 years. But in the past 2 years, actually starting in '82 and running through '83 and still going, it has produced some of the most bizarre weather known in recent history. And I've taken the liberty of making slides of these photos, and unfortunately they're not too good slides because I got a new microflex lens, which means you can take a picture of a postage stamp with great fidelity and detail, but I had not mastered the lighting problems with this new lens, so you have to forgive me. So can we have the first slide here, please? Now this is just the cover, and what you're seeing here, thanks for the focus, this is a picture of South Africa. I'm sorry, yes, South Africa. And the drought, as you know, has been quite severe there for almost 3 years now. And it's gotten so bad that elephants are dying simply because there's no water. And volunteers come out and dig holes for water supply. May I have the next slide? Now, this is some of my great photography. You see the flash kind of burned the center, and since this is all about the effect of the sun and planetary thermodynamics, it kind of comes out surrealistically pretty good, but actually lousy photography. Anyway, you can read the caption. It says, more than a bomb than a storm, a 1983 cyclone blasts Polynesia, sending a Rutua atoll residents staggering towards safety. Theirs was but one price paid when El Nino, a dislocation of the world's largest weather system, flung high winds, rampaging floods, and the misery of drought around the globe. In this particular area of Polynesia, they normally get about one big cyclone or hurricane a year. During this period of 1983, they had 5 major typhoons. Next slide, please. Now this is just, again, my surrealistic photograph, but again, in southern Africa, the damage to the trees. Here a man with a chainsaw is cutting wood off the tops of dead trees just to get some forage material for feeding stock and for fuel. Next slide, please. This is downtown Utah. This is the main street, sandbag, and it just gives you an idea of some of the weather rampages. This picture in the lower end shows an area of the Green River in Utah where all the cars are just buried in mud. Next slide, please. This is off the coast of California, Pacifica, near San Francisco. It simply shows that a huge section of the cliff has been eroded by the repeated storms which you know battered the coast of California. Next slide. This is in the area of Watts. This is one of the streets in Watts in Southern California, famous for the riot. And this is the coastal section showing the damage done by high wave action. Next slide, please. This is Australia. Australia was hit by the worst drought in its history, and this is something like a 7,000-foot high wall of dust over 77,000 square miles, and it just gives you an idea of the ferocity of the weather effects in Australia. Next slide, please. This is a very interesting scene in southern Africa. It shows a village, which I think in many ways is a very lovely aesthetic village when you look at the buildings, the layout, the little fences. But this area has been absolutely devastated by drought. Most of the able-bodied fathers and workmen have left the area to go and get food and water, and it's tended only by children and women. The death rate is unusually high. Next slide, please. This slide shows a feature which I'll bring out later, but now up at the top slide on the left, you see, can I get that top section in a little better focus, please? Because it's a little hard to see. There you go, good. What you have here is the coast of Ecuador, and then you have the Pacific Ocean, and you have the northerly trade winds shown by the number 1, and then you have the westerly flow of the currents, which is normal and natural. There's nothing to do with El Nino. And then you see the dots show the plankton life and how it is distributed on the surface, sinks down and upwells near the coast under arrow number 3, and that is the source of the food chain for the great fishing grounds off of the coast of South America. The bottom panel on the left shows the El Nino effect, where you still have a weakening of the northerly flow of the current, and you have a warming with a big bump there that shows the rise in temperature diagrammatically, and you see the lessened life of the plankton and the algae, which settle down dead and then do not return to the coast to feed the fish, and that's why the fishing has been absolutely devastated off the coast of Ecuador and Peru. This simply shows a storage shed with normally is full of fish meal and fish products, and here are boats that are not going out to sea. Next slide, please. The effects of El Nino are not only on the fishing, on the weather, typhoons, and so on, but this is a shot from the Galapagos Island. This is the normal situation on the left, where in this particular cove you have about 500 booby birds which live there normally. And this shows on the right panel, the same area, what happens when El Nino's effects occurred, which brought about tropical storms, drought, and so on. And even underwater, because of this is off the coast of Panama, this underwater shot, the increased temperature of the water, which some of you know, has been as high as 12 degrees Fahrenheit above the normal temperature for these particular areas. The coral dies from the increased temperature, just like the plankton and the algae have been shown to die in the other picture. And the white parts of the skeletons of the coral, the other parts have survived, but this subjects the coral to increased sensitivity to ultraviolet, and the whole chain of support at the bottom is rapidly dissolving. Next slide, please. This is just a shot from Ecuador, where a river, the bridge here, going right across my photographic burnout, has been washed out, and this is very common. It was a very common occurrence during the height of El Nino in 1983 in Ecuador and Peru. Floods, massive floods. Next slide. I think the only thing I can say about this is look at this panel. This is an ostrich-like emu bird which died in the drought, probably trying to get to a water hole. And to me, that's a symbol of what's going on in the planet. So I will dispense with the slides now until I get more into the details of this situation. Now, I first want you to know that what we're seeing the last 2 years with El Nino is nothing new. There's a long historical precedent for this kind of thing. And let me give you a little background if you're not familiar with this data. The Mayans are probably the best astronomers of any of the ancient civilizations that we know about. And they left records which are in the book called Chimalpoca, in case some of you have read it. It was first published in 1879 by the American Ethnographic Service, which was set up at that time to take care of Indian affairs. The Mayan history states that mankind has gone through 4 cycles of destruction, 1 cycle every 5,168 years. Let me just put that number down because I want you to remember some of these data points. It's a very long cycle, and especially when we think of the Mayans as being a primitive people, which I know we all too easily do. And mankind, and this is the important part of the statement of the Mayan astronomical data, is that mankind is now at the end of the 5th cycle of destruction, which begins March 27th, 1981. I think that's a good data point. Now, what you're going to be interested in is how did the, quote, primitive, unquote, Mayans transmit this kind of high-grade information over thousands and thousands of years. That's the mystery that concerns us. And let me go into it briefly. I don't want to go into detail because you can look this data up. It's all published and available. First, the key to how they develop these cycles starts with their calendar. Now, they did not have one calendar as we did. They actually had 3 calendars. So I'll just label this under calendars. And the first calendar is called the solar calendar, which is the same as ours. All it means is measured by sidereal time, the time it takes the Earth to make one journey around the sun. And that they have computed very accurately, which we only caught up with about 40 years ago. They computed that the solar year was 365.2422 days. Their second calendar was the sacred calendar. And we don't know the origin of that, frankly. I'm still working on the problem. I cannot figure out how they developed this calendar. It is a calendar of 260 days. And this is made up of 20 sacred days. Their month was 20 days, as against our lunar month. And 13 of these 20-day months made up the sacred calendar of 260 days. Their last calendar was the Venus calendar. You have to give them credit now in hindsight for being brilliant astronomers. They observed that the planet Venus, which is universally revered all over the planet, went once around the Earth every 583.805 days. Now, they further observed a very interesting thing, which we've only caught up with recently again. These 3 cycles, each of them a different length, and therefore a different period and some kind of a sine wave function, coincided in other words, all points would return to the beginning of the cycle every 104 years. Which is quite a feat when you stop to think about it. They also divided the 104-year cycle by 2 to get a 52-year sacred calendar. Now, if you go down to Mexico, for example, you'll find that south of Mexico City there is a Cerro Estrelita where every 52 years the descendants of the Mayans, the Mexicans who are there, still carry on this celebration where all the lights are put out in the homes of the people who participated. In the Mayan days, all the lights, all the fires, everything was put out on this particular day in order to avert catastrophe. Somehow they related this 52-year cycle to catastrophe. And I personally have seen that ceremony, and it's quite interesting. And the actual location of the Cerro Estrelita is tied in with the vast pyramid complex. There's a geometry that we won't go into. That's another story. Now, if you multiply 52 years times 100, you get a cycle of 5,200 years, which is where we're getting up to this number here. But the Mayans weren't willing to settle for a rough, round number like that. they did another thing, which is, I think, very clever, is that they had observed that, let me see if I have the data in this. No, I have to do it from memory. Yes, I have data. They also measured the conjunctions of the two biggest planets in our solar system, Jupiter and Saturn, and they found out that 260, and this is a rather peculiar phenomenon, which may be a part of the origin of the sacred year, but 260 Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions equal this number up here, 5,168 years. And it was these, I'll just finish this up, 260 of these. It was 260 Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions which gave rise to this cycle, which in their forecasting system said that it's hard to use their language because it's different from ours, but when the sun would cause, the physical sun would cause the destruction on the planet. And they record the nature of each one of the previous four destructions. We are now, according to their system, in the fifth period, fifth sun period, which, as I say, ends on this date according to their calculations, and then which becomes the beginning of a new cycle. But it's always at the end of the cycle that the destruction occurs. Now, is there any evidence for this mythological, astronomical data from modern science that meshes in this picture at all? Well, there's astoundingly interesting data, which I'm sure a lot of you know about, but I'm going to repeat it. There have been cycles recorded by science, and if you're interested to look up the original report, there's a U.S. National Academy of Science report from 1975, and it's titled Understanding Climatic Changes. And I'll just give you a very brief synopsis of what that rather large report says. It says that the evidence shows, mostly from core samples all over the world, that there is a total glacial cycle of approximately 100,000 years, plus or minus 2,000 years from the core sample data. So this is a glacial and interglacial cycle. Okay? Now, in that 100,000 year cycle, and one of the good areas of measurement has been in this area, Wisconsin and so on, is that this cycle is divided into two parts. The glacial part, where things go glacial and get covered up with ice and snow and so on, lasts 90,000 years. And the interglacial period, which is what we're living in right now, is approximately 10,000 years. And I don't think any scientist on this planet would question the fact that we are in an interglacial period of unparalleled warmth over this 100,000 year cycle. And many of these cycles have been measured. The best cycles usually measure periods, depending on the part of the planet you are, anywhere from a 500,000 year period to up to 2 to 3 million year period. Now, the interesting thing about this cycle is that it can be related to this cycle, and I'll show you how in a second. First place, if you take the 5,168 year cycle and multiply it by 5, you get a period of 25,820 years, which I'm sure most of you recognize as the number which describes the precession of the equinoxes. That means the spin axis of the Earth wobbles or precesses over this 25,820 year period and comes back to the same point of origin. So 5 of these, I'll just put down times 5, make up one equinoctial cycle. And it is very obvious if you do a simple calculation that 4 of these cycles come out pretty close to a 100,000 year cycle, plus or minus 2,000 years. So you have built in to the sediment, into the rocks, into various types of life that is fossilized, a cycle which tells us that what's happening now has happened before, because when they look at these cores, for example, and measure it at the end of one of these 10,000 year cycles, which is twice one of these, at the very end, the deciduous forests in the warm fluvial period of this cycle suddenly disappears, and in its place a lot of shrubs appear and evidence of wind-blown dust, all neatly stacked in the core samples. So we're looking at something that is part of the natural history of the Earth. Unfortunately, mankind's memory is so short, we can barely stretch our historical record back to the beginning of this period, which, as you know, historically is approximately at the beginning of the Sumerian civilization and approximately at the beginning of the Egyptian civilization. And given a little fudging around with figures, it probably represents the early phase of the Chinese civilization, the 3 great civilizations of the Occidental world. But we've left out of that historical record, of course, the record of the Mayans, which has just recently been uncovered. Now, I want to raise a very profound question here. This is just background data, and I don't think there's much argument about that. But what is the real mechanism of this 5,160-year cycle? Now, let's see if I can bring out a mechanism. First, notice that the Mayans already observed that 260 Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions bring about the cycle. And we look at it superficially as a timing mechanism. There's something in the star in the sky, it went around every 19 plus some odd years, and you have a conjunction, and 260 of these add up to this, and somehow that coincides with what's going on at the end of a interglacial period. Well, you have to look at this in another way. This is not a big clock in the sky only. It is a dynamic force. Just think about the Earth going around the moon. The moon going around the Earth. We know that the moon has a tidal action on the Earth, and you can measure it. The land moves up a little bit at full moon. The tides, of course, go up and down. So planets, large massive bodies, do have a gravitational effect on the Earth, which is not very big. But if you look at it as a phenomena where, and I'll just give you the exact number here so you can record it if I can find it. The Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions here are approximately 19.8769 years. So what I'm saying, and this is a speculation, is that this cycle, approximately 19.8 years, is a gravitational wave that goes up and it goes down, and it goes up and it's down. And we know, you can do some calculations and show that this must have an effect on some component of the Earth, because the Earth, as you know, is made up of some kind of a dense material at the core, surmised to be mostly iron, surrounded by a hot so-called inner mantle, and on top of it is a outer mantle, and on top of that is our lithosphere, the little bit of cool rock that we float on. And some part of that system could very well be affected stepwise. Each cycle would have a little stress, a little strain, and the whole thing could rise up to a large envelope, or you have a little gravitational tugs like this, and they reach a peak and they come down, and this would be, the complete cycle would be this number here. Now, the reason I bring up this possibility is that in the El Nino phenomena, which we have from the very reliable reportage of National Geographic, the temperature of the surface of the ocean at the equator in the Pacific rises. And if you try to calculate how many BTUs or joules of energy it would take to heat up that big a bathtub of water, say 12 degrees Fahrenheit, it would take an awful, awful big furnace. Well, that furnace happens to exist underneath the sea. I'm sorry I didn't make any slides, but there are hot strips on the Earth, and it's very hard to illustrate, but just imagine a globe of the Earth, which all of you have seen, and imagine that a strip runs down from the Ural Mountains down through India and the Indian Ocean, and that is a long hot strip measured by a lot of data points on the Earth. That means that down in the outer mantle about approximately 400 kilometers down, there is a long hot strip going down the Earth. Almost opposite that hot strip is another hot strip which is easier to visualize, which is on the west coast of North America and South America, and it runs all the way down from Yukon Territory along the west coast, all the way down through Ecuador and Peru. So you have two big hot strips. Hot strips mean they're heating elements. It means they put out a tremendous amount of energy cyclically, not constantly. And that fits the scheme of nature. Now, in between these two long strips on the planet, and I'll just draw a little diagram, here you have the Ural-Indian Ocean strip like this. This is north, this is south, and here you have the west coast of North and South America, north-south strip. In the Pacific Basin, you have another big hot spot on the equator which looks like this. Now, this hot spot way down in the mantle, which heats the surface, which we can measure, is the source of the El Nino phenomena. Now, it isn't just here that the effect is felt. The original source comes from the subduction under the western edge of the continent of this hot material, which I think is a well-accepted phenomena, and that sets up the thermal cycle where the normal west to east flow of ocean and the east to west flow of the atmosphere is reversed. It brings about the El Nino phenomena. The whole heat engine of the Earth is thrown off. The heat engine, for very simple graphic portrayal, is the trade winds which go from this area north, and in case of the climate we're interested in, which is our continent, it goes up to the area of Alaska, turns down across Canada, and we see it in our daily report of the jet stream. So this is the heat engine that's disturbed, and it brings so much water, hot water, into the atmosphere, fuels the engine, brings about these turbulences, but in other parts of the planet, particularly in the southern parts, Australia, Indonesia, India, South Africa, it brings about extreme drought. In other words, if you're it's like a bank account. If you're going to transfer funds from here to there and you want to keep constant factors in your bank account, you've got to bring in some other money from somewhere else to fill the bank account that's been taken out. But according to this mechanism, the water that would normally circulate from this flow and this atmospheric flow is much more complicated than I'm giving it to you, but I don't want to get lost in the meteorological details. But what is normally a high pressure area here becomes a very low pressure area off the area of northern Australia, and sucks up all the water that would normally fall here. The trade winds are disrupted, and the stuff is sent north. Anyway, that's the heat engine of the planet, and it's a very fundamental phenomenon that you have to take into account, and I'll just repeat that. There are deep subduction zones here and here, and there are hot spots here, here, and here, and these hot spots heat up the surface water, which sends too much steam up in the atmosphere, disturbs the whole engine, the stuff goes north, sets up typhoons, all kind of weather anomalies, and so much water is being shipped in one direction that there's no water left for the other part. So we have a mixture of excess rainfall and all the dynamics that go with it, typhoons, hurricanes, low pressure areas, and you have the drought. So this is the kind of phenomena that is going on. And you have to remember that it's a hypothesis, but I'm putting forth the proposal that every 5,168 years you have this kind of planetary heat effect, which brings about a lot of disturbances. Now I've mentioned the atmospheric part, I've mentioned the ocean part, but along with this thermal upwelling of magma, you also have, and we've had record, I could bring out a sheet of paper if anybody doubts it, of the record earthquakes starting actually in 1976-77. Most of you don't know it probably, but 1976 was the worst earthquake year in recorded history. We had over 1 million people killed and untold property damage and all kind of disruption. The largest damage, of course, was done in the Tangshan earthquake in China in August of 1976. So you have earthquakes, which are simply there because you have the hot magma coming up below the lithosphere, and the lithosphere, if it's going to be lifted, very simple physics, by a big thermal magma, a hot magma, it's going to crack. And that's what earthquakes really are, cracks in the tectonic plates, which is a form of stress release. And we've had plenty of those. And Waverly Persons of the U.S. Geological Survey just issued a report a few days ago which said that 1983 had a record number of big earthquakes on this planet. The second thing, when you have the hot magma coming up, you have the lithosphere cracking, just like dough rising in an oven under heat. You have volcanism. That means some of that hot magma must escape the confining pressures it's under. And we've had great volcanic activity. El Chichon in Mexico is notable for the amount of sulfuric acid thrown up in the atmosphere. I don't know how many of you are aware of it, but the data is all published that it is estimated that there's something like 100 million tons of sulfuric acid in the atmosphere right now, most of it from El Chichon, some of it from some unknown sources which NOAA cannot explain, NOAA being National Ocean and Atmospheric, whatever it's called, project. Now the third aspect of the other aspect of the volcanism, besides the release of sulfur dioxide, which is the original form of the release from the volcano, and then in the air it mixes with water vapor to become sulfuric acid, you also have an enormous amount of dust thrown up in the atmosphere, which again gets into this thermal engine of the earth and fouls it all up in ways which we do not fully understand, no matter how many U-2 planes fly through these clouds and take samples of the dust. The last thing that is most important is that all these mechanisms, now we haven't spoken to man yet, we haven't brought him into the picture, all these mechanisms throw a lot of carbon dioxide, plain old CO2. It's so common that every time we breathe out a whole bunch of it, and it loads up into this room and so on. If we get too much, we kind of have problems with our breathing. But CO2 is ultra important because, and this has been studied intensively for many years by modern science, is that CO2 is believed, and there's debate about this because it's a very hard thing to prove, the more buildup you have of CO2 in the atmosphere, the more you have a so-called hothouse or screening effect, where the sun's rays come through the CO2, and when they reflect to escape into the cold vacuum of outer space, the heat rays are reflected back. And that's classical CO2 greenhouse effect, which increases the thermodynamic pressure on the great heat engine here. Now we've had it coming from magma, we've had it coming through cracks, earthquakes, we've had it coming through volcanism, which not only sends up a lot of hot rock, and we've seen incredible, spectacular pictures on television, right? Everybody sees them of Kilauea in Hawaii spurting off for the last year. Kilauea actually started this big cycle of eruptions, if you probably remember, about November 1st, 1975. So it's been going on and off for some time. Now you have solar radiation trapped through the CO2 effect, and you've got a planet that's building up heat. Well, you say, how come, if it's building up with heat, we got such cold weather here in Minnesota, and how come we have so much snow? That's the next part of the argument. The argument is that these abnormal weather patterns are not so much caused by the absolute temperature at any given point on the planet, but the temperature differential, if this be the planet, between the cold polar areas here, with the spin axis, and the equatorial temperature. Now if this temperature here becomes, let's say right now, just as for argument's sake, that it is 0 degrees at the North Pole, and we'll stick to Fahrenheit because most of you are used to that kind of numbering system. And let's say that you have a temperature of something like, which is pretty high, about 76 degrees Fahrenheit at the equator area. The difference between these two is the differential. In other words, if this is cold, the hot air from here, by this mechanism, wants to go up to the North Pole. Once it gets up there, it either precipitates as snow, or it starts turning around by these huge cells of hot air that come up and heads downward and brings cold air from the polar regions down to the temperate region. So this kind of back and forth oscillation of the vast heat engine of the Earth is what causes abnormally cold weather when you get abnormally hot conditions at the equator. However, this all tends to what we call equilibrium in science. It's a nice term that says everything is cool and easy and we're not having any problems. Things aren't oscillating out of control. They're nice and smooth and even. In biology, we call it a homeostatic effect, with the same idea. So, what will happen, and I'm making a little prediction right now, so listen to me carefully, is this kind of oscillation, the yo-yo effect of the heat differential between the poles and equator, will tend toward equilibrium. But a very curious mechanism, and this is not published material, this is my own scientific analysis, leads me to believe that you can have, in this 5,600 year period, a period in which you have, let's say this is the end of that particular cycle, a period in which you have a buildup of the heat inside the Earth through all the mechanisms I've described. I'm talking about the mantle and the lithosphere. And when you reach a certain point, and this is the end of this cycle, the heat is going to start dropping down. In other words, there's going to be a reversal in which you have the Earth acting as a heat sink. Those of you who don't know what that term means, if you are soldering something and your soldering iron is real hot, and you want to draw the heat away from the end of the soldering iron, use a certain type of material which absorbs heat. That's called a heat sink. It's just like a sink in your kitchen in which the water goes down the drain. You lose heat. the Earth undergoes the next phase of this cycle, and it's the heat sink cycle. And this is very important. You won't find this in any literature because I don't think anybody's thought of this absolutely wild idea that the Earth could be a heat sink. They always think of it as giving off endless energy like Mother Earth, who is never going to give up on feeding her little children. Well, there is a reversal point. There are a lot of indications of it. The first indication you're going to get is this coming summer. I've calculated when this should happen. Now, you know we've had record cold all over the world during this December, January, not February, period on the Earth. That's a matter of fact. And the cold has been extreme. That has broke all existing records that we have. And that is a first sign of a reversal of a heat source planet to a heat sink planet. Now, like all cooling things, it's just not going to suddenly switch to cool. It's going to switch to cool in little spots. There are going to be little cracks here, there, depending on the underlying conditions. Each one of those little points, let's say you have, to make it very graphic, magma rising on the west coast of Ecuador. Instead of the magma rising, it's going to like slide back into its little hole. It's just the start of the phenomena that I'm talking about this coming summer, and it'll last for several years. In other words, at the height of crop season, you're going to see sudden freezes that are going to do terrible things to our food supply, to put it very bluntly. And I'm sticking my neck out because that is a logical deduction from all the things I'm telling you, including the timing of when this will occur. Now, there are a lot of other things going on. I'm just going to go over my notes very quickly with you so we don't get lost. The heavy rainfall, this pluvial period, this warm interglacial period that's been going on 2 times this, even though each one is a separate cycle, has had an effect on the planet that we rarely stop to think about. And I'll give it to you very quickly because there's a lot of documentation on this. Anybody's interested after the talk, I can give you the sources for this phenomena. There's been a continual leaching out and washing away of the minerals of the soil all over the planet. That, in a nutshell, is the result of millions of man-hours of research. This demineralizes the topsoil, and the thing that we are seeing right now, this demineralization ends up in the global death of the great forests. Now, everybody in this room, I'm sure, has read that the great Schwarzwald forests of Germany, West Germany, are dying. Nobody knows why. It was gradually noticed roughly over the last 20 years, but became serious in the last 10 years. The most recent data that we have on the great Appalachian forest chain from Alabama to the northern tip of Maine, same phenomena. The Appalachian forests are dying. Nobody knows why. Everybody hollers acid rain, all kind of things, but there's no proof. I'm saying there's a much deeper mechanism than that we suspect. It's part of the end of this cycle. It's part of the demineralization of the soil. And there's another factor which I don't want to bring up in too great detail, but it has to do with something called ELF, extremely low frequencies, which is mentioned in the title of my talk. I have spent actually most of my time in the last 7 years since I first discovered that the Soviet Union was bombarding the planet with extremely low frequency signals, which are essentially magnetic waves in the frequency range from about 6 hertz up to my most recent measurements are in the range of 18 hertz. Now these signals come in, anybody in this room can pick up these signals on your shortwave set. You can find them splashing through all the bands, and a good place to look is about 10.85 megahertz. I think it's the 19-meter band. and you will find this rat-tat-tat-tat-tat signal coming through. It sounds like a machine gun. That is the Soviet ELF signal. There's a whole story. I don't want to go into it, but very briefly, I tried to be a good citizen and alert our government, that is the U.S. government, and very specific agencies from the CIA down in 1977 with the data that I had accumulated showing that this signal, the ELF signal of the Soviet, is not an over-the-horizon radar, is not a new method of communicating with submarine, but is in fact a psychoactive signal. That means that it works on your brain. And we now know, after a lot of years of research, that ELF is very frequency specific. For example, we have artificial generators, which is how I did the original work. You can beam a person without their knowledge. You can lock them up in a Faraday's cage, in a submarine, in a great vault. ELF will pass through everything. It is not attenuated by any material known on Earth. It'll go a million meters without any measurable attenuation. So there's no shield against it. And this signal at about 6.6 hertz will make you very depressed. It's a classical symptom about beaming this room, which is very easy to do. You just have a little signal generator this big, and pretty soon you begin to feel the old Minnesota March depression, which is a well-known phenomenon in all northern climate. The Russians use this occasionally, but they like mostly the 11 hertz signal, which makes human beings very agitated and very, well, it leads to riotous behavior. They have caused several great blackouts and riots. The last one that we know about is the July 1977, I think it was July 9th, 77 blackout of New York City when people went berserk. A global network of people that I'm associated with monitored the Soviet signal for 3 days before the event occurred in New York, and they were hammering very specifically in a way to bring a very powerful signal down the Hudson Valley for 3 days before the actual blackout and the riots occurred. There is another frequency, and I'll get into this later, 8 hertz, same as the alpha frequency of your brain, which makes you feel very good. Fact is, if you measure a trained yogin who has been training for years and can go into instant meditation, you'll find that their brain peaks in the frequency analysis of the brain at 8 hertz. And this is a very good effect. And it's a very long, complicated physiological story why this is a good effect, and the other two frequencies, a few cycles away, are very bad. If you are interested in this phenomena, the last week's issue, and I brought a copy of it with me if anybody wants to look at it, a Science magazine has a report by 3 scientists from the Naval Medical Research Laboratories at Bethesda, in which they show conclusively, in my opinion, from analyzing their data, that the frequency range that they examined, which was 15 hertz to 4,000 hertz, they did not look at the frequencies I just mentioned to you, but that's hot classified stuff in the U.S., and you're not supposed to know about that. This frequency range in cultured fibroblasts, human fibroblasts, will cause an activation of DNA multiplication. And the article very clearly states that ELF at the levels given, and they're from 10 to the minus 5 to 10 to the minus 6 Tesla, which is an extremely weak magnetic signal, are mutagenic. It's not my word, it's theirs. Mutagenic in layman's language means that you get mutations in the cells, and the most common mutation, and this is I know from classified information, is cancer. So these tiny, tiny weak signals are very frequency specific. Unfortunately, the government has classified most of the data, but I happen to have access to it, and I'm not afraid to talk about it, because there's nothing they can do to me anymore in the way I think. And this is the kind of effect that is a part of this whole mechanism. Now let me explain why. I'm not laying the blame for any of this phenomenon on the Soviets, okay? Even though they started July 4th, 1976. I'm saying that the natural resonant frequency of the Earth, and this has been known since 1954, and it's between the ionosphere and the Earth, is 7.82 hertz. Okay? So that signal, if you want to know how that originates, the sun, our sun, S-U-N, sends a big plasma wave out in its magnetic fields, which spread throughout the solar system. And these waves are of very long periods. Some of them are days long. I mean, each cycle takes a day long. And a lot of them are in this frequency range of 7.82 hertz. As the magnetic waves come from the sun and hit the Earth, this acts like a capacitor here and traps 7.82 hertz, or more properly speaking, filters it out of the solar plasma coming past the Earth. So this is the signal that's close to 8 hertz. I use 8 hertz as a round number, but this is the real frequency for those who are technically involved in this field. This frequency is present on the planet all the time. It's the driving frequency that controls living things. We now have data that shows that if you have a center frequency in the human body, and that's measured by nuclear magnetic resonance techniques, can be measured by EEG, by magnetoencephalogram. If you have a center frequency of around 8 hertz and a spread around that frequency out to maybe 200 or 300 hertz, you have a normally operating physiological system. Why is that so? It's because this frequency works on the hydrogen atom of the bonding of DNA. Remember, DNA is two coils of DNA, and there's kind of a zipper effect down the coils, which is due to hydrogen bonding between the two DNA systems. It's that hydrogen bond which has been measured in a lot of different systems, which resonates not at this frequency. This is what keeps that bond stable. The hydrogen bond, it keeps it stable. But if you deviate the least bit toward, let's say, 6 at this end, or go over 11 at this end, you then get a triggering of DNA replication, and that can go many different ways. I'll give you a small example. I'm very deeply immersed in the research of all this, and we were wondering, when I say we, I worked with a group of scientists, wondering why the Soviets had recently shifted their signal from 11 hertz to 18 hertz. That's what you measure when you pick it up off the air. And we found out when we artificially stimulated human beings with 18 hertz that it's equivalent, it takes about 2 hours to take effect. It's equivalent to taking about 20 milligrams of dexedrine. In other words, you start speeding. And the speeding is not due to the same mechanism as dexedrine. It's due to the fact that at those frequencies, around 18 hertz, 16, not quite precise, you do get increased cell division due to this stimulation of the DNA mechanism. Now, the exact mechanism of the cancer effect, some of you may be interested in. The DNA starts dividing. Okay, it sends out a signal to the RNA. Let's just make it the messenger RNA here. One of the forms of RNA goes to the ribosome, which is a part of the nuclear mechanism that determines the sequence in which amino acids are put together to produce peptides. And those peptides are the enzymes that run most of the body mechanism. So it's been found in mice that this is the mechanism that is screwing up the order in which amino acids are produced, producing the wrong kind of amino acid, unnatural amino acids. These in turn lead to what we call a mutagenic or carcinogenic action, and this has been clearly shown in mice. Unfortunately, that paper is also classified, but I'm giving you the bottom line. Now, I want to skip ahead because I'm probably running over my time. Yep. And get to, I'm going to skip a lot of the mechanisms that are involved here, which are very important to know. But I want to get to my main point. My main point may shock a lot of you, but I'm willing to run that risk. And you can get back at me in the question and answer period. The main point is there anything that human beings can do, individually or collectively, to prevent the full working out of the cycle we're talking about? Namely, the immediate effects being the negative effect on the food chain and civilization, and in fact due to the mutagenic mechanism involved in this disturbed ELF resonance of the field during this type of period when you have thermodynamic and sync effects throwing off these resonant frequencies. Now that's a very, very heavy question, and you'll have to forgive me for bringing it up, but I think we ought to face fundamental issues and not consider life a quick waltz or a gay dance that we must get through without looking at any of the realities. In answer to that question, I say yes. I say we have enough technical skill, we have enough knowledge, we have enough giant machines, and I'll mention what they are, to influence this system enough so that life can get by without too big destruction, okay? There's going to be a lot of destruction. It's going on right now. The rate of life loss on this planet is absolutely appalling every day just from the effects of what we've seen the last 2 years. Now, I say that yes, the answer is yes, but it would require something which is almost impossible for human beings to do. It would mean that human beings all over this planet, all 4 billion of them, would have to stop their quarrels immediately, and they are endless as we know, and enter into a cooperative effort, probably over a 10-year period, in order to save themselves and mankind in general. Mankind, I mean genetically speaking. Now, if mankind could do this, it would probably be the most glorious period of human history, because it means that in mobilizing in the face of this external threat, which is a huge mechanism that we just beginning to find out about, we could perhaps have our finest and most glorious hour in the history of mankind. Now, let me just cite very briefly, and we can go into this in the question period, what it would take to bring about such a miracle. Now, first I want you to know several facts. From my data, from other people's data, for example, Bucky Fuller was a great friend of mine. I worked with him over the years, and we had much in common. We worked on many of these problems. One of the last statements he made in June of '83 in Baltimore, before he died, he said that mankind has only 3 years left in which to make up its mind about what to do about what I'm talking about. And he was largely influenced in his thinking by the work of a man some of you may know, John Haymaker of Michigan, Lansing, Michigan, who wrote a book which I have here somewhere if anybody wants to look at it, called The Survival of Civilization. And Haymaker has come to the conclusion of what this time cycle is based on the effects on living things on the planet, mostly plants, including dying forests and demineralization of the soil, and the CO2, carbon dioxide cycle particularly. So with a man like Bucky Fuller, who I have the greatest respect, I think he was one of the last great scientists of the Renaissance mold who lived on this planet, says something like that, I have to take it seriously. So what would it take to tackle, with some hope of solution, of this problem, knowing that the timetable given by people like Bucky Fuller saying we've got 3 years in which to get something going to counter this thing, or people like Haneker saying that we have until 1990, and if we don't do something by 1990, that by 1995 we can start phasing out of the process called civilization. Those are pretty heavy ideas to deal with, and most of us really can't face them squarely. What I think would have to be done is the following. One, human beings being what they are, you would have to have a charismatic political leader who would have to take up the torch, that is, somebody around whom all of humanity could rally in order to initiate minimal cooperation between all governments. The only person I know around, and this is just a suggestion, you may have other ideas, somebody like Pierre Elliott Trudeau and his recent mission for the last several months trying to get the heads of states to get together and do something about the nuke problem. Just a suggestion. Two, you would have to have a charismatic scientific leader who would be able to persuade all scientists that there is a viable technological solution. At the moment, I frankly cannot think of a world-class scientist who would have that kind of charisma and power to mobilize technological and scientific resources. Number three, again, human beings being what they are, and the fact that we have tremendous global communication capability through television and satellites, etc., we'd have to find a cinematographic genius who would have to produce a motion picture equivalent in impact to what happened with the film called A Day After, which was shown recently and is still being shown around the world. This would have to be done in order to alert and educate each one of the 4 billion inhabitants of the earth. Again, I don't know who would be qualified to do that, but I'm sure there's somebody around who could do it. 4, once such cooperation has begun, and of course that's mission impossible to even get that kind of cooperation going, concrete acts can be initiated. This is in the technological domain. I didn't mention to you that there are giant ELF transmitters on this earth. We know for sure from satellite and other kind of monitoring that the Soviets have 7 operational ELF transmitters, each operating approximately in the 100 megawatt range. The United States, in trying to catch up with the Soviet Union, has now built 3 ELF transmitters. You have to put them on the right part of the planet. The Soviets have theirs up here on this arc, and to counter them we have to put them down here. So we have built 3. One is in South Africa, one is in Antarctica, and the other is in Australia, in the Alice Springs area. They're not fully operational. They go on off the air. My scientist colleagues help monitor all these activities. Now all these transmitters, ELF transmitters on Earth, and as I say we have 10 of them, fully operational now, should be stopped in the frequencies they're transmitting, because they're all bad frequencies for man and beast. And I don't want to go into all that detail, but there's a lot of documentation on that. They should all be tuned to an 8 hertz frequency. And the reason for that is to support plants, plankton, fish, animals, man, etc., in order to stimulate growth, even if it's artificial, in order to start reducing the carbon dioxide cycle. The only way you're going to get rid of the carbon dioxide cycle is to bring onto the earth billions and billions and billions and billions ad infinitum plants that can take in the CO2 from the atmosphere and store it in the form of sugars or whatever chemical product a particular plant makes. At the same time, returning more oxygen, O2, to the air to lower the percent concentration of the CO2. Next point, is that the entire Earth should be covered with a dusting of Mont Morillonite, the chalky powder that has, as far as chemical analysis has shown, most of the 72 trace minerals that are required for healthy plant and animal and human growth. Now, it would be a great trick if all the air forces of the world, all of them, would cooperate to go around and spray dust all over the planet, which would help to bring back the dying forests and rehabilitate parts of the planet which haven't seen forests for centuries. Next, we must cease all synthetic fertilizers in agriculture and go back to labor-intensive organic agricultural methods. I don't have to belabor that point because I understand you've been instructed and advised by Don Carlson as to what the effect of all that is. Next point, most difficult. Mankind must somehow get together to cut down all noxious gas and carbon dioxide emissions from industry, vehicles, aircraft, ships, as soon as possible. I know that's mission impossible, just do that one thing. But without all these things being done, you're not going to win the battle. E, restore ultraviolet ozone shield in the stratosphere. There's been a depletion, as all of you know, from the last 10 years monitoring of the ozone shield in the stratosphere against the harmful effects of UV. And you can actually use these giant ELF transmitters to create ozone in the air. You can do it very scientifically and very selectively. F, plants. Billions and billions of trees all over the planet must be put into place and growing under healthy conditions to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. G, more people will be needed to be moved to habitable parts of the planet as the glacial climate sets in polewards. Now, this is a horrible thought that northern climates, there's very little in this scheme that will act over the next 10 or 20 years to change the climate in the northern part of the planet because of this thermodynamic engine. It will take a while to shut it down, mostly pulling the CO2 out of the atmosphere. So plans must be made to somehow move those who are in the north that live energy-intensive lives, and it may be very difficult to carry on life when these mini freezes start and cut down the food chain, the food supply. This obviously means that if you can move people around globally, I'm not just talking about Canada to Mexico or something like that, I'm talking about globally, you obviously are going to have to just abolish all immigration laws and forget that they exist. Otherwise you'll never be able to accomplish this. H, now you've got to purify and clean all water supplies for man, animal, and plants. Now there are different ways of cleaning, purifying, taking care of water, but the first thing you have to do after you get through ordinary filtration and try to clean up the aquifers is there is a method, and some of you may know about this, of charging water with magnetic fields. I've been part of an experiment going on in Mexico for the last 10 years where water in irrigation tubes of 4-inch diameter is run through magnetic fields, and when the water comes out, its properties are changed. And when you put that kind of water on trees, on sugarcane, various plant products, on chicken feed and so on, you get within a matter of 6 months about a doubling of your crop yield without any additional input of fertilizer, nitrogen, phosphorus, etc. So there are techniques that have not been tried that can be used. Of course, we have Don Carlson's techniques locally, which could spread all over the world. Now, the last point is that some kind of biological or biotechnology has to be introduced almost immediately, and this is in the wings, as some of you may know, to introduce frost-resistant plant bacteria to plants to withstand cold and freezing, and this has been shown to be feasible. Anyway, I'm sorry to dump all of this on you on a heavy, snowy night. But that's the end of my story. I welcome all comments that you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
First, I want them who is against me. I want to get some arguments going.
Well, you say that this woodpecker signal transmitted by the Russians, that's an ultra-high frequency. It's in the microwave band, and you still say it's low frequency.
No.
How do you work that?
I got to explain that, and I just skipped over that because what it amounts to. I'm going to erase some of this stuff. Okay, here's what you have. The Soviets have these giant oscillators, 100 megawatts, and let's start in the frequency scale. This is low frequency and that's ultra high frequency, and you have them put a pulse in to the earth. Actually, they don't put it into an antenna, into the earth. Now this pulse is like all pulses that shows the Fourier content. It has all frequencies in it because it is a pulse. Okay, standard electronic engineering. That pulse now emits higher and higher frequencies, and I'll just show bands here like this, and I'll explain them in a moment. Okay, let's say we're up here in the television band, let's say 400 megahertz as an example. When the Soviet signal is strong, megahertz, you can pick it up on your TV set. Have any of you ever picked it up on your TV set? Okay. Lower frequencies, FM, you can pick it up in the FM frequency band, roughly sub 100 megahertz range. You can pick it up in shortwave, you can pick it up in medium wave, and of course you can pick up the original signal if you have very, very sophisticated equipment. So what you're seeing here is a splash through of higher harmonics, okay? And we've picked up to about the 28th harmonic very cleanly. And anyway, that is standard state of art, but I'm glad you asked that question. Explain why these frequencies appear in the higher frequencies band when they're really trying to resonate this cavity in the ELF, extremely low frequency range, obviously for warfare purposes. Okay. A little background will help all of us. First, everything we know about ELF was discovered between 1892 and 1900 by Nikola Tesla. And if you read his Colorado Spring notebook, every one of these experiments are there. How to design the equipment. The Soviets just copied the Tesla equipment. Tesla found out a number of things. One is you could inject these currents, but at different frequencies. And I don't want to go into all the details. You could inject these currents into the ionosphere and light up the night sky the way we do with sodium vapor now, okay? Number one. Number two, he showed that if you hit certain resonant frequencies of the Earth, you could pound it, and he estimated that it would take about two weeks of pounding of the Earth with a sonic offshoot of the ELF equipment. The Earth would just split apart like an apple, and the calculations are very impressive. Thirdly, he showed how you can modify the weather on the planet. Okay? Now the reason the Soviets, as near as intelligence can find out, the reason that the Soviets entered into this, I call it the Nikola Tesla program, is the Soviets have a very bad problem. They cannot produce enough food. They're already in the problem that I'm talking about. Because they found out a long time ago, over a 30-year measurement, that the Arctic Ocean has dropped 3 degrees centigrade. For every drop of 1 degree centigrade in the Arctic Ocean, they lose 1 week of growing time. That's a very serious problem, okay? And their whole system is going to collapse, not because of the Great War between the communists and the capitalists, but because they can't produce enough food for their own people. So the original purpose of this scheme was to see if they could modify the weather. And in fact, they did modify the weather significantly on the planet. And if some of you are interested in that, it's all been published in a journal we started in Canada. We couldn't do it in the United States, called Planetary Association for Clean Energy, PACE in short. Dennis has the data on how to get hold of that journal. But we've monitored collectively, a whole group of scientists, ex officio from whatever our jobs are, what the Soviets have done to modify the weather pattern of the planet. In the course of doing the weather modification, they unfortunately ran into some of the dynamics that we're talking about and did trigger several big earthquakes in Iran and China. We have good documentation on that. But they stopped that. They realized that was counterproductive. So these are the reasons they went into this, and they have not given up. They've been on the air more or less continuously. Sometimes they'll stop for a week, but more or less continuously since July 4th, 1976. So it is initially it was designed to help them in their own problem. They found out it had global effect. How we found out all about this is a long story, which I've documented in a book which will never be published because we have a censorship bureau, in case you don't know, in the United States. It keeps books from being published that are not very popular. But we found out that the Soviets stuffed the Ottawa embassy in Canada with about 28 so-called attachés, all of whom were scientists who were monitoring the effects of this signal in Canada, because they designed this beam to go through certain towns. One was Timmins, Ontario, Ottawa, and so on. And we got people in every town to monitor on their own what was going on with the Soviet signal. And the Soviet agents would go out there, and we passed this information on to the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and they got on the tail of these guys for a year and a half, found out they were indeed doing nothing but monitoring the effects of ELS in Canada and reporting back to Russia, and they were all kicked out of the Soviet Union, if you remember what happened in about February of 1979. So anyway, it's a very sad, long struggle between. Effects were deadly in Canada. In Timmins, which was the main target of this signal, there was a marked increase in hearing problems and deafness, because the ear is very sensitive to these extremely low frequencies. They found a great increase in eye problems. They found an increase in cancer. There was an enormous increase in mental hospital admissions. They found out a whole series of effects. Originally, the government of Canada was going to publish this data, but the U.S. government leaned on them and persuaded them not to do it because they felt it was not good to alarm the public. And so this data has never gotten out in the public domain. Yes?
Where are these transmitters located?
The transmitters are located at very specific sites. They've all been photographed. It's a big job to build a transmitter. First you have to dig an enormous hole in the ground, and that can be very easily picked up by satellite photography. And you have to move a lot of material out and then a lot of material in, and they build these huge steel domes, all of which have been, as a matter of fact, General George Keegan, the Chief of Intelligence of the Air Force, was most responsible for documenting the entire buildup of the Soviet ELF transmitters, including getting gas samples of the emissions and so on, so they're pretty sure what they were doing. And the original transmitter went up in Riga, in the area of Latvia, you know where that is. And then the next transmitter was over west of there, I forget the name of the town, and so on, all the way out to the Kamchatka Peninsula. So they ringed the Soviet Union, 7 of these.
Are they not directional or directed towards?
They're not directional because of the long wave. The wave is enormously long. And what they do is they take 2 of them and they phase shift them and get the frequency, beat frequency difference between them. And that way they can control the frequency and steer them so that when they go around the planet, they form a beam that's only 42 miles wide. The way we found that out, in this town of Timmins, the government forbid anybody to talk about ELF or do anything about it. And so the mayor of the town was very clever, and what he did was instructed all truck drivers who entered the town to look for on their CBs, the signal that's splashing up into the CB band, and as they entered a certain area, they would pick up the signal, and then when they left the area, they would lose the signal. So that's how we established that the signal was 42 miles wide. It is steerable, but you have to use, there's a very complex geometry of the planet that's involved. So the signal doesn't go into the air like all radio transmissions. It goes into the earth, reflects back, forms a great circle around the planet 42 miles wide, and that can be controlled in terms of intensity and steering depending on where your two transmitters are. It's a very complex problem in radio transmission.
There are people on this planet who are qualified to deal with this. This here is all, of course, irrelevant because it's all a thing.
Right.
Are the people on this ball because you're...
All right, let me give you the answer to that. First, I beat my chompers, that's the word, for 3 years in the British government, the U.S. government, and I'm talking about all agencies, all up and down the ladder, Canadian government, Mexican government, so on, to try to persuade them that these things were real. When I say real, that they had an effect on human beings. It took them 3.5 years, and I gave them the circuit diagrams, how to do the experiment. You can do the whole experiment in 1 day. It's not complicated. It took them 3.5 years to be persuaded that the signal was psychoactive. And finally, when they found that out, the money came out through DARPA, and then more money that's hidden in the budget to build the 3 big transmitters. So that was a big rush job. I found out that every government person, I could cite hundreds of them that I've talked to in these different governments, are not really aware of all this because it's not standard textbook stuff. They don't know where to start thinking. So the people, yeah. No, I don't think so. But the people who are qualified is the group of some 50 or so scientists that I've worked with scattered all over the planet over the last 7 years. They know how to build it. It's not difficult, for example, to build these devices. Have any of you ever heard of the People's Power Project here in Minneapolis? Yeah. Okay. Anyway,
They're supposed to be transmitting from Timmins to Belgrade here, and all of a sudden the project died.
yeah, that's because the guy in Timmins was bought off, Richardson. Anyway, I came here to Minneapolis and to Belgrade specifically 6 years ago, and had a meeting that looked like a Nazi rally in a Munich beer hall, and talked to these farmers and told them, look, here's the circuit diagram, here's how to build an ELF transmitter. The problem, as you know, is that the electric power company was going to build high tension lines across their farmland, which would interfere with their circular irrigation system. So anyway, just on simple directions, it took 2 days of briefing. We sent in some technical people. They built the whole damn thing, and it worked. The guy at the other end, though, unfortunately was bought out by the Canadian government. He was part of the original project. So it's not hard to mobilize people to defend themselves when they're real, in this case, their lives are at stake, over a period of time. Yeah.
Qualification for any job is still the ability to do it. It doesn't have anything to do with anything else. And there are people who are thinking along these lines.
Yeah, that's what you need, is you need the spirit that realizes it's a real problem. People are willing to dedicate their lives, just like when you're in the military and you ask for volunteers for a suicide mission to go out and help everybody else. I mean, that's the kind of thing you have to do. Yeah, you want to cut it off? Any more questions?
What kind of a transmitter was it that you suggested? What kind of circuitry? Or do you have any suggestions?
The one here for the...
Yes.
The circuitry was very simple. It was direct Tesla design. It's in all his book. It was a big primary coil as big as this room, a secondary coil. The whole thing resonated at about 25,000 cycles. It had a peak power output. It wasn't that high. It was about half a megawatt was peak power. And you drove it by a standard...
This is what, the conventional punch wave generator?
Yeah, right. Conventional. Nothing unusual, except tuned to these very low frequencies. and designed, as Tesla did, to transmit power. So it's no big deal. The farmers did it. You can check it. The guy who was the chairman was Will Misha. You can check on the progress. I really admire these farmers for doing that job. Okay?
Okay, fine. Well,
Catch you later.
thank you, Andrea. You have a few minutes there if you want to talk to Andrea briefly, and then we got to clear the place in 10 minutes.
I'll be tomorrow at Dennis House. No, I have to find out. Oh, you did? Fully aware of what?